Good evening and welcome home to Grace Avenue United Methodist Church. We are so excited that you have joined us tonight for a conversation that we are calling Next Steps. This is a follow-up to the conversation we had last week when we came together and began to talk about race in our country and in our churches and in our world and how it affects us. And we are so pleased to follow up on that conversation. One of the things that came out of our conversation last week was so many people said, yes, this is so much on my heart, but I want to know, what can we do about it? And so we've decided for the next 4 weeks to try to just expand on that conversation, and each week take a particular topic in which we're going to attempt to answer some of those questions about what it is we think we can do. Tonight I'm joined by my friend and my colleague, and tonight our host again, Dr. Ron Henderson, the District Superintendent of the North Central District of the North Texas Conference of the United Methodist Church, and we are so pleased he is with us. And also as our special guest tonight, I have Jessica Aziz, and Jessica is here tonight. She is the co-pastor of the Modern Worship Service here at Grace Avenue United Methodist Church. She's a graduate of Perkins School of Theology with a Master of Divinity degree. And Jessica has been very much involved in community organizing in the city of Dallas. Prior to being at Grace Avenue, she worked for an organization called Faith in Texas. And she is very well equipped tonight. And I'm so excited about the things we're going to learn from Jessica as we talk about voter engagement. So that's our subject tonight. We're going to talk about voter engagement. With all of everything else that's going on, we know that one of the things that we can all do is that we can get out and vote. But it's not as simple as that. And we're going to talk about how that is impacted by history and by dreaming and visioning what we can be in the future. So I'm glad that you've joined us, and we look forward to this time tonight. I need to let you know that Laura Eccles-Richter is monitoring the conversation tonight on Facebook Live and on the live stream. So if you have a question you want to ask, we'll get to those. Just type those in to the comments section, and we will get those there. Or if you just want to let us know you're here tonight, we'd love to know that you're with us tonight, and we're again so glad that you have chosen to join us. We thought we'd start with a real simple thing tonight. We thought we'd just each give you a little bit of background about the first time we ever voted. That seems like a reasonable place to begin. We're all voters sitting around this conversation tonight. So, Ron, I wonder if you'd just tell us, you remember the first time you voted?
I remember the first time I voted, but before that, I remember when I became vote conscious.
Okay.
I became vote conscious when I was 9 years old, 1960. I hadn't turned 10 yet, and that was when John F. Kennedy was running against Richard Nixon.
Yes.
And voting for the president was talked about a lot in our house. And I remember my parents' excitement about voting for John F. Kennedy. So I became vote conscious in 1960. I remember vividly LBJ running in 1964 and Hubert Humphrey running against Richard Nixon in 1968. And my first time to vote was 1972. Okay. I voted for George McGovern.
Yeah.
George McGovern versus Richard Nixon.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And where did you vote? Where was that?
It was in Dallas.
Okay.
I don't know where I went, but I remember being very proud and very excited about it. And so that in 1972, you still had to be 21 years of age before you could vote. And so that September, I turned, I guess I'd been 21 for a year, but that was the first time I voted. And I was a proud person.
Yeah. What is a proud moment the first time you voted? I remember the first time I voted, it was a little anticlimactic. I turned 18. 18 was the voting age at that time. And I turned 18 in December of 1976, which meant I missed the general election and the presidential election between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford by a month. So I didn't get to vote in that election. But I remember that the following spring in the town where I lived in Tyler, Texas, we had a school bond election. And they actually got us very involved in trying to drum up support for the school bond in Tyler, Texas. And I remember getting out and talking to people. And I remember how proud I was the first time I got to cast my vote in the affirmative for that school bond election. Like so many of the school bond elections in Tyler, Texas, it was voted down. And I remember a lot of the retired people in Tyler just said, well, if it was good enough for us, it's good enough for you kids today. But I was very proud that I voted in the spring of 1977 for the school bond in Tyler, Texas. Jessica?
So I don't know if I'm excited or ashamed to say the year because it's such a stretch, but the first time I voted was in 2008. So it was McCain versus Obama. And I did not grow up in a home where we talked about voting. I am actually fifth-generation immigrant, so I've been in, Texas family for many generations. Never talked about voting. Never really was vote conscious, but I grew up always wondering about injustice and how much it had affected my family. And so when I had that opportunity for the first time to do something about it, I voted in 2008. And my story is very interesting. The first time I voted was, I remember being at, it was some sort of community event. I don't even know how I got there or why, but it was some sort of justice-oriented event, and another Latina had walked up to me, and the way that she engaged me was she said, do you have somebody that you love that's impacted by criminal justice? And I said, yes. Just continuing the conversation, and she basically asked me my story. How did that feel? What was that like for you? And that whole conversation led me to actually, being registered to vote and voting for the first time. But I really, for you, Dr. Henderson, for me, I didn't become vote conscious really until after the election of 2008. That's what really pushed me to get really involved in a movement for change. So,
well, as similar as our stories are also very different, and some of that is just because of the way in which we react to things that have happened in the history of our country. And I know, Ron, you've done a little bit of research to just remind us that voter rights and the way voting has taken place in this country has not always happened with a great deal of justice or equity. Could you just give us a little bit of a background of some of your knowledge about some of the things that have been challenges across the years to voter engagement?
Sure. I hope all of it's correct, but I believe the first vote in America was 1770, and it had a subtitle, White Male Landowners Only. So that eliminated women. It certainly eliminated African Americans in 1770. And then in 1870, African American males were allowed to vote. But the South put up barriers to African American males voting. Number one was poll taxes. And probably more important that affected them was literary test. Can you imagine 1870, emancipation 1865, you can imagine the large number of black males who could not read. And so literary tests, in some southern states, all the way up to 1960s, were barriers for persons to prevent people from voting. We do live in a good time. Since I've been somewhat politically conscious, I remember the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I remember watching, as I watched much of the civil rights movement on television in the Deep South, and I remember the marches from Selma to Montgomery. I remember the first one, that's Bloody Sunday, when they were turned around with dogs and fire hoses and other things. And I remember when they made it a week later, I believe, when a goodly number of white Americans that saw the brutality of persons who were marching so they could vote joined ranks with them, and it deeply affected LBJ. And so Congress, passed the Voting Rights Act, 1965, passed by 80% in both the House and the Senate. The House was 78 to 18 votes. I looked that up. And following that in 1965, it led to a number of African Americans being elected mayors in some of America's major urban cities. Carl Stokes in Cleveland in 1967. I think Coleman Young was elected in Detroit about 73. Tom Bradley elected mayor in Los Angeles. A few years later, Harold Washington in Chicago. And also Maynard Jackson, who was from Dallas, was elected in Atlanta, I believe first time in 1974. So it's kind of a history that people were empowered because of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That eliminated all of those barriers, those barriers that were put up to suppress people from voting, poll taxes, literary tests, etc.
And yet I think we would all three agree that although the Voting Rights Act of 1965 did many things, there were still people out in the world attempting to suppress voting among people of color, and it still goes on today. So part of the pivot here for us is to say, so what do we do in 2020? How do we begin to take action? And you know, Jessica, I was bemused by your comment about the fact that you were sort of embarrassed to tell us when you first voted because you're so much younger than us. And yet, one of the things that Ron and I are so hopeful about today is someone like you who can give us some real valid information about what voting is going to need to look like and how we overcome that suppression even in this day and time. And I know you got some important thoughts about power because, right, all of this is eventually about power and how power is used and what power can do. So love to hear some of your opening thoughts about voter engagement.
So, you know, voter engagement, the way that it normally happens one is that there's so much focus on the presidential election, right? There's so much coverage, so much push for the presidential election when actually so much change, legislation, policy change that can really affect people's everyday lives really happens at the local and the state level, right? And so in transactional voter engagement, there's so much focus on presidential, and the really key focus is turning out voters, right? We have people who will set up, you know, a stand at Kroger and, you know, register voters or hope to engage people to say, hey, are you registered to vote? And the person can kind of say yes or no and, you know, go about their business. And that person that's hoping to engage those folks to vote, you know, just kind of prays and hopes and wishes that they'll show up to the polls on election day. Whereas transformational voter engagement work that I had the opportunity of doing was very, very different because it was actually using the election as an opportunity to bridge people together, to bring people together of who in our community has the same shared values that we do. How do we build a prophetic vision of equity, of racial, of social justice equity? And how do we bring those people together to amass political power? And so one of the vote consciousness, the things that had to shake me up was about power. And so for me, being a public theologian, being a community organizer, somebody who's out in the streets able to share the gospel with people is realizing that, man, our churches have a tremendous amount of power, right? And there's this quote that I want to read from Dr. King. And Dr. King says in there, he says, power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental. He says, power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. And so I think there's a moment in time when we see all these protests that are happening where we can be outgoing to engage voters, but what's so different with transformational is that, first of all, the people that are leading the voter engagement work is the people that we say they are closest to the pain, closest to the issues of criminal justice, closest to the issues of immigration. Those are the people who know their communities and their people best, right? And so it's reassessing resources into Black and Brown-led organizations, Black and Brown-centered organizations to do transformational work. But do you want to get into like tangible, real tangible stuff?
Keep going.
Yeah, so one of the things too is that how we engage people in our community. So we were going door to door, right? And we weren't going door to door a month before the election. We were going door to door a year before the election, because one of the things that needs to happen, I think, spiritually, is to regain trust, right? I mean, so many people ask me all the time, Jessica, why are so many young people leaving the church? Why are so many people, young people, disenchanted with our country and how our nation is? And for me, it was because there was a big bridge between personal holiness that the church taught and the social holiness. So to give a very basic example, for me, I grew up in a church where the pastor regularly talked and preached about stewardship and tithing, which is good. It's an aspect of discipleship. However, we were in a community that most of the people were not making a fair wage. Most of the community was making minimum wage. And so for me, as a young person, as a person of color who was affected by police brutality, who was affected by immigration, who was affected by all these things, I was asking, where's the connection, right, within the church? And so those are some of the things that propelled me to, one, become a voter registrar, right? So getting connected into your county, wherever you live, and you take a real simple test to be able to become a voter registrar. But even for me, it's engaging with other people of color and engaging with younger people and saying, here's how you can act. You can become a voter registrar. You can be a voice in your high schools, making sure that your high schools are registering seniors to vote, because that is actually required by state law, and there's many schools that do not encourage that and push for that and use their own resources to do that. So those are some tangible things of what kind of transformational voting looked like for me versus transactional.
So in terms of that, I think that's a really good point about that it's not just about casting a vote, it's about becoming part of a community. And I think one of the things that I know is that there are a lot of people that are discouraged by the system. That's what you talked about. There are so many young people that are discouraged by the system, and there are people of color that are discouraged by the system. I think part of the protests right now are people coming out and saying, yes, we're mad about this. And prior to that, they were just apathetic. I wonder if both of you would just kind of, from your different perspectives, talk a little bit about how would you speak a word of encouragement to people about the value of voting, and not just the value of voting, but the value of being a part of a community that lifts up the importance of communal decision making. How do you encourage people, Ron?
For me, probably what's important is that leadership is important.
Okay.
We're doing a lot of appropriate conversations now, like Black Lives Matter. Leadership matters. And I think leadership sets a tone. It sets a tone for any institution. Leadership sets a tone for the community. And so when we have injustice that make us sick, I think it's important to have leadership with people who want to see the reign of God. People who have demonstrated they have passion and compassion for God's people, for God's creation. Leadership matters tremendously. We have seen the harm leadership can do, and we have seen how leadership can bring people together. So one of the words for me is we need to get the attention of broader America with protesting against injustice and oppression. But then we have to channel that energy and that creativity and get people registered and go to vote for leadership that will transform America. So one of my words of encouragement is that leadership matters.
Leadership matters. So Jessica, I mean, you just described how when you were doing your previous work, you were going door to door. I can only imagine how discouraging at times that must be. Because behind those doors, a lot of times, are people who are suspicious and they don't trust, and they've lost that. So how do you? What's your word of encouragement to somebody when somebody opens that door?
Yeah.
How do you encourage people?
So actually, for us, when we were going door to door registering voters and asking their story in the poorest and most criminalized zip codes of Dallas County. I mean, we pulled up the information, the data that showed how Black and brown young men were being targeted more than any other zip code. And that's where we started. And like you said, Ron, leadership does matter, because we were paying people a livable wage. We were paying, $18 an hour to invest in that community by hiring people who were from that community to actually do the voter engagement. And so it wasn't actually discouraging for us in that context. One, because when we were going door to door, and I think it was summer, so it's Texas heat, like we're feeling now, 100 degrees, we're sweating, going door to door, talking to people. But it was actually so encouraging, because we were using, again, that opportunity to have sacred conversations, is the way that I talk about it. Is that we weren't going to door and saying, hey, are you registered to vote? Yes or no, slam the door, or if they even open the door, right? But we were going door to door and saying, do you have somebody you love that's affected by criminal justice? Do you have a story of somebody who's been affected by the healthcare system or payday loans? We were targeting the issues, and then we were inviting people to share their story. And I think something that does resonate for people, regardless of if they're in Dallas County or Denton County, is people want to share their story. They want a space where they can be heard. Right? And so for me, that was an encouragement, because we were able to offer some tangible hope and inviting them into a movement, right? Saying, I understand your hurt. I understand your anger. Let me invite you into this movement, where they saw people from all walks of life, backgrounds, faith traditions, actually joining together to try to do some good. So that was a huge encouragement. And I think people need to know it's possible, it's doable for us to come together and to really be united in that type of work. So that was a huge aspect for me of encouragement.
So you raised these issues of partnership. So I just wondered if we could try to be specific even in that moment about, so if there's somebody out there tonight saying, I'm fired up about this, I want to do something, I'd like to get in partnership with a community, a group that is really doing some solid work with voter engagement and social justice. Who are some of those groups that you could pick up the phone or call or send an email to or a text?
So I would start with the first one from the community organization that I worked with, which was Faith in Texas. They are somewhere you can go that's very local. We did a lot of anti-racism training. One of the things that we had churches that were like Grace Avenue, progressive values, that were more affluent churches, kind of more in the suburbs, that wanted to partner in these criminalized zip codes. But we had to do some ally, training of how do you come and walk alongside these people in solidarity as you're doing voter engagement, right? And so Faith in Texas is one of them. They are doing a lot of on-the-ground work, voter engagement. And then if more nationally for things like criminal justice is Faith in Action, which is PICO, formerly known as PICO, and Live Free. Those are Black and brown centered and Black and brown led organizations that are doing this type of work.
Okay. So one of the things we promised to do too is tomorrow we'll send out lists, and we'll repost this when we have the recording of this put out. We'll put those links so that people can make sure that they can do that. But I think those organizations are great. Ron, what about you? Go around to a lot of churches as the district superintendent. In the midst of going around to other churches, what do you see in terms of how people build community and how churches might get involved? We've talked a lot about how churches need to be on the front of this discussion, not behind this discussion. And in a lot of places, voter engagement has started in churches. As you would go around to churches in our district, what would you want to say to people about that?
Well, one of the things I noticed in many of the churches that I go to in Collin County and even in rural Collin County and in Denton County, all of our churches usually have someone in their congregation or ones who are on the city council, a school board, a county commissioner, And that's seemingly every church. Now, we have 60 churches, so it's not every municipality. And they're grateful and they're proud of the persons from their congregation who are serving the citizenry this way. I think we have to look for people who cherish our values of building a community where all people are welcome and cherished and valued. I think the church can be pivotal in knowing what candidates stand for, and also asking those representatives who are part of our congregations that they understand the hurt and pain and that they represent us in those places. I don't know if I gave you what
I can speak to some of that as well for churches.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, one of the goals that we had is that every congregation that we worked with, whether it was synagogue, a mosque, or you know, Christian-based organization, our goal was 100% voting congregations.
Wow. Yeah.
100%. So what we had to do was we created a voter engagement team within that congregation. And these were the core people who were responsible for becoming voter registrars, who were, you know, making sure that the information on when to vote and how to vote and what was on the ballot was accessible to people. We did things where, again, to be transformational, to build relationships of solidarity, again, before the election, we would actually worship together. We would host one another to worship together, to break bread together, to build those relationships together, and then we would go and show up at a city council meeting or things like that were affecting our local community in that area. Yeah. And then one of the things that we would do as a church is that we would have days where we would celebrate on election day. We would all literally pack up in our vans, our church vans, and we would head to the polls together. And then we would, you know, celebrate, have a worship service to celebrate together. And that community didn't end with election day. And I think what also gave a lot of hope to people is that we weren't, again, just trying to get out the vote. We were there for power. We were there to be able to say, as a church, as a faith community that is concerned about the well-being of our community, we were there to govern the agenda. So it was a larger vision of not just voting, but we are here to set the standard of what equity should look like in our city. And that's where we came together to talk about it, to listen, to pray, and to put that together from all walks of life. And so I think that kind of help shape a little vision around that.
So let me be sure I heard this right. So you would encourage churches to become 100% voting congregations.
That's right.
Think about that. What a fabulous thing. And part of what you brought up earlier, you know, Jessica, one of the reasons that this fits so well in the United Methodist Church is because, right, Wesley helped us understand that we need to be people of personal holiness.
Yep.
Personal discipleship is so important, but we are also people of social holiness, and it's when the combination of those two things get rolling that we can be completely what God has made us to be. But I think it's just so important. You're right, Ron. I mean, I bet you in every congregation there's somebody that's been elected to something. Maybe either formally or currently, and maybe it's even just something like being on a community board or something like that. But being able to talk to those people and engage with those people and learn about what they do, but then also making our voices heard in the midst of that is, I think, really important.
And for me, is not to forget this great privilege, this right we have now. You know, as an example, I remember 1965. And every election, whatever it is, whether it's a municipal election, a school board election, a bond election, I'm mindful of persons who made a sacrifice of their life so that black people could vote. I remember in 1994, I didn't go, but I had friends who were monitors in 1994 when blacks in South Africa voted for the first time. 1994, one of our colleagues, Charles Stovall, was one of the monitors. And to see people who stood in line, if not days, 10, 12 hours, for the very first time to vote in South Africa, 1994. And of course, that's when Nelson Mandela was elected president. when you see those sacrifices and the privilege we have to vote, whatever it is, I feel a moral, spiritual obligation to go and vote for people who I think can help rein in the righteousness of God.
So I'm going to get us kind of out of bounds here and maybe even into a little bit of trouble, but that's okay. That we're having a real discussion and we're talking about real things to do. Some of it is we need to vote. Some of it is how we vote, right? And so I'd love to hear both of you right now. There is a pretty active debate going on in our country, particularly in the world of COVID-19, about whether or not people have to physically go to a voting place or whether we can envision and enact some form of being able to vote in which people don't have to actually physically show up at a polling place. Got some ideas about that, Jessica, about whether or not we could do that?
I think we absolutely should. One of the things that I've always kind of scratched my head about and was so frustrated about is just how many things that we're able to do online, right? We can, do our vehicle registration. We can, what are some other things we can do online? I just lost my...
Well, your driver's license online, you do
renewal.
vehicle registration.
There's all kinds of things that we can do online, and it just... again, going back to speaking clearly what it is, of voter suppression, of why we're not able to vote online, So I think, yes, absolutely, we should have access to it, and the government should be the one that is making it extremely accessible to all people. I know, like in the Latino community, for people who English is not their first language, so many do not vote. One, they don't even know they have the right to vote. But two, they do not vote because there's a lack of information that's in Spanish. There's so many hurdles that people have to jump in order just to know, where do I go to vote? Who do I talk to if I have a question? And so, yeah, this is a huge deal. We need to be pushing for online, for ways that we can eliminate as much voter suppression as we can. So I'm for it. But yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. Ron, you want to say a word about that?
Sure, I do, because I think as preachers, as pastors, we have, I think, a prophetic responsibility to interpret what's happening in our culture. And we have a Christian responsibility when we see wickedness to identify wickedness, evil, and sin. And when I see acts that I interpret as acts of voter suppression, picture ID, those who fight mail-in ballots, in some states they're even fighting the time the polls are open to eliminate people from voting. Some fighting absentee balloting to eliminate people from voting. And so as a preacher, my first interpretation is this is not of God. To suppress people's right to vote is wicked and evil and sinful. So that's one of the things I pay attention to, and one of the reasons why I vote, and will do anything I can to make certain all people are empowered, able to vote.
Yeah. Have you ever had to vote absentee?
No, I don't think so.
You ever had to vote absentee? I have. So I told my story about that I missed the presidential election. The next general election came up 2 years after that, and I was a student in college. And I voted absentee from college, and it was a very important thing. And, that was a long time ago, and we figured it out. I got to believe with all of the technology we have now, and really smart, creative people, we can get this done. Is there going to be probably some mishaps and abuse? There is with everything, but not any more so than what we probably have in person at times. I was laughing with Jessica and Ron before about watching the things that happened after the presidential election of 2000, in which there were people holding cards up to the light to see if there were hanging chads. So you're going to have some of that, but the reality of it is I think we're just more creative and imaginative than that. You were saying something about you couldn't remember the different things we do online. You know what I do most online that reminds me of voting, that I have to do securely? I pay all my bills online.
Yes, I
right?
do.
That's a form of voting, right? When I pay my bills,
That's
I'm
right.
voting
That's
with my
power.
pocketbook. So
That's
yeah.
right.
But I do want to tell you, without any exaggeration, one of my most prized possessions, I have several that I'm proud of, having a driver's license, I'm proud of that.
Yeah.
And to have an insurance card, I'm very proud of it. But every few years, when I get that renewal of my voter's registration card, that is a prized possession. And I look at it and look at the address and the precinct and all of that, and I cherish it. Every time it's renewed, I cherish it that I'm eligible not only to vote, but to make a difference.
Right, absolutely. I'm going to look out into the audience for a minute now and see if Laura Eccles-Richter has a question or something that's come up. And Laura, it's good to be with you tonight.
Good to be here. So Sherry Clark just mentioned that along with the responsibility of voting comes the responsibility of educating ourselves about who and what we are voting for. And there's just some string around that. But where can people get the information to be able to really educate themselves about who they're voting for? It takes time. The last election, there were a lot of different things on the ballot where I remember sitting down with both Colin and Lawson really looking through all of that. And so where do you get your information about everything that's on the ballot? Because there's some things on the ballot a lot of times that aren't the top things, and that's going to happen this November as well.
What do you think, Jess?
So, League of Women Voters is the place that I usually go to for really good voter guides. So I always refer people to League of Women Voters, first off. The second thing I want to mention with that, too, is, so many people ask, why aren't younger people voting? I get asked a lot, even with my Black brothers and sisters, is like, where are Latinos in this fight as well? And for me, it's because this is the issue. It's that we get fired up. Yes, we obviously want change, but then we actually look at the voter guide or the information, and it's gibberish to us in a lot of ways. So one of the things that we have to do together that I think we have the power to do as a community is maybe we need to make more voter guides that speak the language of people who don't understand it. And so I think that's a transformational way of doing voter engagement that we can involve ourselves in as well.
For me, Laura, I grew up in a culture in the Black church where it was a spiritual institution, Christian institution, but it was the hub of everything in the Black community. So it was not only the religious institution, it was a social institution, and it was a place where the Black church took a vital interest in candidates and getting people out to vote. And so that's been a part of my church experience in the Black church. It took an active role in getting to know who was running, who was going to represent our community, who were the people we could trust to create a life that we desired. Who was it we trust could govern, who would govern with righteousness. And I believe in the church today, those things still govern us. Who can create the beloved community we want, and we pay attention to what they say.
Right.
How they say it, what they've done in the past. Who do we think will govern with righteousness? We see so many politicians today who just have a mean spirit.
And they're not accountable to anybody really either at the end of the day, so.
Well, and
they think they aren't.
Yeah, the important point too about after the election, about what we do after the election. So one of the things I would also just advise and say, okay, so after an election is over, we've got to be active about writing our representatives and contacting them. And so then when the next election comes up, you can say, how responsive was that person to me? Did they listen to my concerns? Did they represent me well? And then you have a little bit of a foundation to be able to say, I know something of this person's record. When I contacted them and sought them out, they at least listened to me and responded to me well. And so I think that's the other thing. It's not, you can't just vote and then think about what am I going to do next time I vote.
Yeah.
How are you engaged with then elected officials after they become elected officials?
Right.
Yeah. Laura?
Conversation just about the fact that it's all of the elections. So it's learning what are the elections at the local level, what are the elections at the state level, and what do those really mean? I mean, what are those positions, and what are they responsible for, and how do we lean into learning more about that? And so I think that part of what is just being talked about is that all of the elections are important, and yet sometimes we don't turn out for some of those others, and how important they are in the life of the overall.
Absolutely.
Well, it's going to be
community.
unique this year because all of these elections have been collapsed into the general election. Because of COVID-19, we would have had a school board election and a city council election here in Frisco and in other communities as well, but that now was all postponed. All of those things now are going to get collapsed into the November general election.
Well, you know, I was thinking there are some districts in Dallas County that was maybe a Republican stronghold for years. And then with a coalition of young people and diversity in the neighborhood, there was more than one representative who held that seat for over 20 years. And then another representative who identified more with the people unseated that person who had that seat for 20-some years, more than one occasion. Now, some people say that perhaps they rode on the coattail of O'Rourke. Regardless, it was a statewide national election that filtered down to local districts.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. You know, all of it is going to fold in, and we saw some of that in the last national election.
Yeah. What's the quote? All politics are local. Right?
Yes.
Sometimes right in my own house. Go ahead, Laura.
So Kim Eifert, straight from surgery.
Hi, Kim.
So Kim, we're hoping you're feeling okay. How does the church walk the fine line of voting engagement and not endorsing a candidate or a platform?
That's a good question. So because congregations are 501c3, there is a very, very fine line with that. So one of the things that we did was, rather than talking about in our congregations becoming 100% voting, instead of talking about the candidates or who was running, we really specifically focused on the issues. So for example, we would talk about, for criminal justice, you know, we would talk about what agenda had things like police accountability with requiring dash cameras, with racial bias training. So there is a very fine line, but it's possible in focusing on the issues versus the candidate. And what we had to do, honestly, because that's another way that even I think the government suppresses the role of the church in this area, is we had to put voter guides together that actually spoke specifically of the issues without putting the candidate's name, so that people could get the voter guide, say, okay, this matters to me, this doesn't, and then they were able to kind of make their decision from there. There was a lot of work that we had to do to create the ways for the church to be able, because of how much suppression's around, to be able to do that kind of work.
Well, let me take maybe a little different view.
Okay.
Because government may try to suppress that, but we have seen politicians in high places who have used certain religious groups,
Oh, for sure.
evangelicals, the right, and they play to that group, manipulate that group, and use the group so they can get the votes. And so they've always wanted to look at the more progressives and say, you know, you can't do that, but they've taken a page out of the playbook and playing it very well.
Yeah.
And not only nationally, but in the state elections.
Right.
Some politicians who are part of the more conservative movement have used the religious groups to their advantage, big time.
Well, and I think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but sometimes on both sides of the equation, politicians will show up in pulpits.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
Oh, yeah.
And what do you guys feel about that?
Well, I certainly been a part of that in the past, in the black culture.
Okay, say more.
Whereas the black church endorsed candidates, a particular candidate. I think I got to the point where I didn't just allow someone in who showed up during election time, but someone who had a track record, who had proven that he or she was a friend of the community, all of the community. When I saw that in a person, I think I quit allowing it in the pulpit, but I created opportunities in the church, at breakfast, at some other study or an event, where they had a good avenue to share with the congregants what he or she would do for the community. And I'm not pastoring now. If I was, I would hope to be able to.
Yeah.
In my experience, I think a lot of politicians who go into pulpits are going obviously to win votes, right? If I were to invite a politician into a pulpit or into a church space, it would be to invite them to listen to the actual community, to listen to the people, and to, with the people, co-create whatever their legislation or agenda actually looks like. Because I think it needs, the transformation I think that sometimes needs to happen is that we kind of get into that mindset that the politicians don't work for us, you know what I mean, where their role is to serve us. And I've seen so many times where they come in this sense of power, assuming they know what's best for the community, and assuming they know best how to distribute the resources before actually listening to the community. So for me, that's a more helpful way that I would see a politician in a pulpit, is to actually come and listen to the community and be willing to shape their agenda around what the community has to offer.
It's a great word, this idea of co-create, right? That we don't just elect people to do stuff for us.
Right.
Yes.
We elect people who will listen to us and then help co-create the kinds of communities we want to live in, the kinds of communities we want to serve.
Right.
And be able to change their minds. Right. The Lyndon Baines Johnson of 1965 is not the same Lyndon Baines Johnson of 1960.
Yeah. And I think politicians get so fearful about changing their minds because of the retaliation that they face, right? However, if they came in with the attitude of, I'm here to listen and to co-create with you, then we would probably most likely say, hey, we got your back even when you change your mind, because you came in with the right, what's the right, not persona, but the right, you know what I'm saying? Attitude, thank you. Attitude, yeah, exactly, so.
Okay, Laura, you look like you wanted to ask something else. Are we good? Okay, I want to bring up a quick subject, and then we're going to give some closing words. This whole discussion we had just a moment ago reminds me that I am very concerned about a movement that is taking place within our country that is referred to as Christian nationalism. And I need to tell you that I am aware of churches, even in this community, who are meeting with their members and are basically saying to their members, the only people you should ever vote for anything are people who are Christians. Therefore, if somebody is on the ballot who is of another religion or another faith, or maybe who has not chosen to profess any faith publicly, that you should automatically eliminate those people from your willingness to vote for them. You should just take them off the list. Don't try to find out anything else about them, because they're not of your religion. We're all Christians, and we all know that Christians are the ones who founded this country, and Christians are the only one that should be elected to public office in this country. I wonder if the two of you might just respond to that briefly in terms of how that runs against our understanding of what faith in Christ is really about.
I don't mind going
Please.
first. I would begin by saying that I am a Christian, and I have chosen Jesus Christ as the way to lead me to God. And I'm a Christian unapologetically. My faith does not lead me to devalue other faiths. My faith does not lead me to devalue other person's journey toward God. I don't think I'm any more holy than a Jewish person. And so even though Christianity is the way I have chosen and I embrace, and Jesus lead me to God, I do not devalue or dismiss other faiths and their authenticity or their integrity. Other faiths, other religions do not exclude Christianity as being an authentic faith. Christianity is one of the few religions that excludes all other religions. Now, it's the way I've chosen, but I'm grateful that my journey has taken me that I can honor and value other faiths. And if there's a person of another faith running for office who has demonstrated a commitment to God, a commitment to God's reign on earth, a commitment to all of God's people, I could see myself supporting a person. I don't know if I've had that examination, but it's certainly not anything I would be fearful of.
Okay. Jessica.
So I think for me that question runs very deep, and I will say even when I went to an all-white Southern Baptist Bible college where I was surrounded by that mentality and the need to assimilate and to deny my own heritage and pride in a lot of ways. And you know, there's so much ignorance behind the fact that we share the same Abrahamic tradition, right? Our Muslim brothers and sisters share the same prophets. They believe in Jesus Christ. Yes, not as Messiah, but there's a lot of faith tradition there, even with our Jewish brothers and sisters. And so I think we need to reclaim the shared tradition that we do have. But I do think for me, even it runs personally just because, you know, there was a time where I was, when I was going to Criswell College, that was the college that I attended, where I first was studying the Bible, and that's where I was learning a lot of these fear tactics of if it's not Christian, it's not good, or it's not of God. And I got challenged by that when I dated a Palestinian, right, who is now my husband and who grew up in a Muslim home. And I had to learn to reclaim the fact that Jesus was Arab. Jesus was a Palestinian. Jesus was a Jew before Christianity became a thing. And so there's so much of that history that we need to, I think, keep reteaching or teaching to folks that we need to reclaim. And so I think there's just a lot of education that needs to be done. But I also think that we need to be spiritually discerning with understanding what is the fear behind that's driving that for people, and being able to speak to that as well. And so I think that takes a lot of wisdom to be able to do that.
I am suspicious of a candidate who, in order to win an election, would say, you should vote for me because I am a Christian and my opponent is not. I think that is a very dangerous thing. And quite honestly, for me, it runs against not just our democracy, it runs against the very essence of our faith, of who we are as the representatives of Jesus Christ in the world. And I just think that's really important. Hey, this thing has started to run down really quick, and we're almost to the very end, so I wanted to give you both just a chance for some closing statements, and maybe there are some things. I got to tell you that Ron and Jessica have both become so prepared tonight. I'm sure we haven't even gotten to the tip of the iceberg of all the things they wanted to talk about, but I wonder if there was just a final word you would leave with folks tonight. What would that word be? We'll start with you, Jessica.
Sure. So I would say that anger, the emotion that you're feeling, let's use it for good, right? And so one of the things that we're going to be talking about and that I want to invite you into for Grace Avenue as a whole is starting a voter engagement team, right? Let's start learning what it is to be a transformational voice in our community. Educating people, creating voter guides that are accessible and easy to understand. And so if you're interested in doing that or being a part of that, I would love for you to email me, Jessica, JESSECA, @graceavenue.org. So because I think we do. With our values and the hearts that we have a tremendous opportunity and responsibility to really build a prophetic vision in Frisco, in Collin County, and Denton County. So I want to see us do that.
Awesome. Voter engagement team. Let's get it started here.
It.
And if you're from somewhere else, get one started somewhere else. Ron.
Well, the key word thing for me, in light of all that has happened in America over the last 3 months, and particularly the last couple of weeks, and I've had to decide, what am I going to do in the midst of all of this? And I have decided, according to the word of God, said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called, I paraphrase, sons and daughters of God.
Wow.
And I decided I'm going to be a peacemaker. I'm not going to fight with words or with violence, but all of the giftedness and love that God has bestowed on me, that I've experienced through so many other people, that I am conscious that I'm going to be a peacemaker. That's what I'm committed to.
And peacemakers are not passive.
That's right.
Peacemakers are out active in the world and engaged in the
They're
world
angry,
and
they're
engaged in
lamenting,
this,
yes.
in this process. And I think that's a great word for us, Ron, to kind of as we pull us out tonight. Well, again, thank you so much for being with us. We're going to continue this conversation next week as we talk about next steps. We're going to be together, and our host, Ron Henderson, will be here, and our guest next week will be the Reverend Bryant Phelps, who many of you know, the pastor of the Church of the Disciple, United Methodist Church of the Disciple down in DeSoto, and he's going to be talking about race and economic injustice. We're going to have a great conversation and invite you back into that and think about how we can take next steps. Listen, last night I saw something that moved me deeply as it talked about this whole idea of voter engagement. And the quote was basically that the beauty of our democracy is not found in the halls of Congress. The beauty of our democracy is not found in the Oval Office. The beauty of our democracy is not necessarily even found in our Supreme Court. The beauty of our democracy is found with people standing in line to vote. That's where the beauty of our democracy is, when individuals are able to take that God-given right. And what we want to make sure in this coming time, especially in regards to the conversations right now, is that everyone, regardless of their race or their gender, regardless of any of their background, that they are not suppressed but feel the freedom that the three of us feel tonight, to be able to go out and exercise our right to vote. That's the beauty of our democracy, and it all comes together because we're part of a community of love in Jesus Christ. Jessica, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Ron, thank you so much for being here with us. Have a great night. We look forward to being with you again next week. God bless.